So this is being live streamed as well.
Marvellous.
So how are you?
Thank you.
Coffee.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Jeff, you'll tell me when you're ready. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, welcome to ROSL and to the latest in our series of discussions that we have been instituting over the last year or so. And today we're incredibly lucky to have the President of the Confederation of British Industry, that is his current position in a sort of public space, Lord Bilimoria. He is particularly famous for all sorts of things. He is a classic example of a brilliant entrepreneur, the producer and provider of Cobra beer, which he's very kindly provided us with some this evening, so thank you very much for that. But his family has an extraordinary story of military service, really, but of huge competence over many, many generations. I think his father and his grandfather were both in the Indian Army, or your grandfather would have been in the British Indian Army. They weren't just foot soldiers. These were people who were very distinguished leaders in the Indian Army. And Lord Bilimoria has a very distinguished academic career, graduate of Cambridge, I think, and the chancellor of Birmingham University, a university from which my own father got an honorary doctorate, I would just note. I think a fascinating example of somebody who has brought to the British economy jobs and prosperity, somebody who is entrepreneurial. And we're going to talk quite a lot about this tonight, but in every country, it's the entrepreneurs who are the people who drive the improvements in productivity and the growth in the economy. And they are not many. They are few and far between. And it's always a great privilege to meet one. When you read back over Lord Bilimoria's history, you'll see that there are times when he had very little money. He borrowed a little bit of money from a bank, £30,000 or something. So it would have been quite a lot of money in those days, I suppose. Invested it and built an empire out of it. It's an extraordinary story. But today, as I said, he's the President of the Confederation of British Industry. And the CBI, of course, a leading business organisation in the country, an organisation which has shown great leadership in supporting the interests of the business community, sometimes with success and sometimes without success. And today is a day where the government is imposing new taxes on business and on working people, so look forward to hearing what he has to say about that as well. Lord Bilimoria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And first and foremost, it's a privilege to be here, back at the Royal Overseas League. It's somewhere I'm very, very familiar with over many years in this hall and in the institution, in the club. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you also to Annette, and thank you for all that you've done to organise this. And lots of familiar faces, Peter Flavel sitting right here, and Her Excellency, High Commissioner for India is over here, a great friend. Firstly, apologies, I'm a few minutes late. It's one of those things where it's outside your control. In the House of Lords, today I was speaking twice. I spoke about climate change in question time, and then we had the Armed Forces Bill. And if there's a bill that you're speaking in, a debate, the rules are that you have to be there at the beginning, and you have to be there at the end for all the closing speeches. So until the minister sat down, I couldn't leave, and luckily the timings all sort of worked out, and here I am roughly on time, but it could have been worse. But thank you for your patience. So and the Armed Forces Bill is very important to me because, as you've just heard from Alexander, was brought up in the army. So my grandfather was a King's Commissioned Officer, very few of them. In the First World War, by the way, I don't know how many of you know this, but 1 million Indians served in the First World War. And over 70,000 lost their lives. And I'm very privileged to be president, chairman of the Memorial Gates. So I don't know how many of you know the Memorial Gates, these beautiful sandstone gates with a pavilion just next to Buckingham Palace and Hyde Park Corner. And that is to commemorate the service and sacrifice of the 5 million who served in the First and Second World War from South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. And it is so important that we never forget that. And my grandfather, the million, Alexander spoke about the million in the First World War, you know, they were not allowed to become officers. They only served in the ranks. I'll take questions later on if you don't mind.
No questions now.
Louder! Is that loud enough? Is that better? I thought you were behaving like one of my peers and intervening in my speech. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I will try and speak as loudly as this. I'm so sorry. So the 1 million were basically in the ranks, and the medics were allowed to become officers. And then after the First World War, they said, oh gosh, without them we would have lost this war. So let's make a few of them officers. So 8 per course at Sandhurst, twice a year, 8 Indians, very competitive, were allowed to become officers. And then they started the Indian Military Academy in 1932, which my father was commissioned from. So my grandfather, in that 10-year period between 1922 and 1932, was one of those, what they were called King's Commissioned Officers. And so I've got this military heritage that I'm proud of, and that's why I speak in defense matters. And of course, this year, I spoke about it as the 50th anniversary of the creation of Bangladesh. And my father fought in the liberation of Bangladesh. The person who wrote the book, General Cardozo, wrote a book just recently, 71, wrote a book about my father, also served there as well. And of course, my father was commissioned in the Gurkhas. And I was brought up with the Gurkhas. His regiment, the 2nd, 5th Gurkha Rifles Frontier Force, very well known for being, they were called the Victoria Cross Battalion, because they won 3 Victoria Crosses in the Second World War. 1 posthumous, 2 I was brought up with from childhood. And the story goes that when my father was away, when I was born, and a telegram was sent, and Gaje Gale, one of the 2 VCs, surviving VCs, one was very slim and one was very tubby. They were Laurel and Hardy. So Hardy, I believe, jumped up for joy at the news of the birth of his captain's boy, and the ground shook. And so these legends that I was lucky to be brought up with. And as Field Marshal Manekshaw said, if a man said he's not afraid of dying, he's either lying or he's a Gurkha. So legendary troops that I was privileged to serve. I came to study here at the age of 19, and fast forward, I have for some years now been the president of UKISA, the UK Council for International Student Affairs. It looks after the interests of all international students in the UK. So now that's 550,000. And I'm also co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Students. So I believe that's, we can talk about this, but it's one of our strongest elements of soft power is that we have the best universities in the world, along with the United States of America, by far. Yesterday I was at my old university, Cambridge. I chaired the business school there for 5 years. And they are outstanding. Birmingham, you mentioned, which I'm proud to be chancellor of, one of the ROSL Group universities, our equivalent of the Ivy League. They are terrific. I mean, if you say which universities won the most Nobel Prizes in the world, it's not Harvard or Princeton or Caltech or Stanford. It's Cambridge University. So, which country has more world leaders who've been educated from their universities at any one time? It's either America or the United Kingdom. So I don't think we should ever take our universities for granted. And talking about soft power, we also need to talk about hard power. And I think we also underestimate in this country that we may be tiny, but we have huge elements of hard power, including our armed forces, what I was just talking about now. And I serve as an honorary group captain in the Royal Air Force. We've just started our Space Command now this year. Of course, our nuclear deterrent is one of our strongest elements of hard power as well. wearing my CBI hat, if I just lay out a few things that we can maybe discuss, we have got the fastest private sector growth at the moment since May 2014. We've got huge supply chain disruption. We've got labor and material shortages. We've got what we say is a new settlement of living with the virus. We believe that we've got to look forward and live with the virus. I think the government has done a great job, but we need to build an economy based on confidence. What I've noticed is these 18 months, what has worked as president of CBI, I've been president for most of those 18 months, I'm halfway through my tenure, is working with government. And to be frank, during the Brexit years, the CBI and the government did not have a good relationship because the CBI was speaking up for its members and 85% of British business wanted to remain. So the CBI, if you're to represent your members, you have to speak on behalf of your members. And this is before my time. But we've now built bridges to such an extent that I can proudly say that we have worked alongside the government in every aspect. The job retention scheme that has saved millions of jobs and millions of businesses was totally in collaboration with the CBI. And I could give you example after example of how we've worked with the government throughout this pandemic. And the three principles that we think the settlement is based on is mass testing. This is something that I feel very strongly about. It's something that I identified a year ago. I'm talking about August last year is when I first started saying to the government, start implementing mass testing. You have these lateral flow tests that are not as accurate as PCR, but they're cheap and they're affordable. And if we test the population regularly, you can isolate people who are positive and the rest of the economy can carry on and you don't have to shut down the economy. And this is after we'd already been shut down from March the 23rd until July. So we'd had a 3.5-month shutdown. We'd seen the huge damage that did to our economy and to every other aspect of our lives. I said, let's not do this, let's have mass testing. Government wouldn't listen. Came to November, and I would ask this not only as CBI president, but also in the House of Lords. And I kept challenging government, and I didn't give up. And I remember it was in November, and it was around the 7th or 8th of November, and I asked again why we weren't implementing mass testing. And the health minister said, Lord Bilimoria, you have won this argument, and we're inspired by you. I mean, it was a virtual, I was sitting down. I mean, if I'd been standing up, I mean, I would have probably collapsed in surprise. And from then on, if you remember, they did the Liverpool trials, and you fast forward, and now we've had mass testing available freely to all offices, all factories, and to individuals. And here's the crux of it. This is one of the challenges. Government, sometimes they listen, but they don't listen quickly enough. August, I've been pushing for this. Oxford University did a test from April to June. I don't know how many of you are aware of this test, of 200 schools. 200 schools. 100 of them with 100,000 children and 10,000 staff. Another 100,000 students, 10,000 staff. One half carried on the system that we've been using where if one person, one in a class or in a boarding house gets test positive, everyone in the bubble has to isolate. You know, at one stage over 1 million children were isolating. The other group, one person tested positive, they isolated, everyone else took regular lateral flow tests. They didn't miss a single day's school. And you know what the result was at the end of it? Exactly the same. So we wasted all this time, which we could have not been locked down, where if we'd only implemented this. And it's so cheap. It's just, that's the frustrating part, is when it's not listened to. We need to carry on with COVID secure tools. We advise, masks in certain places. I saw that in the chamber today. And our vaccine program, our world-leading vaccine program. And the third aspect that people don't talk about is therapeutics. Now, how many of you here, let me see a show of hands, have heard of the drug Ivamectin? Can I see a show of hands, please? High Commissioner's put a hand up. Ivamectin. 2 hands.
Yes.
2 hands. Now, I could send you email after email. I came to know about this in January in my wife is South African. We were locked down in South Africa for 3.5 months. All flights cancelled. Not a bad place to be locked down, by the way, in Cape Town in summer. So, Ivamectin, this drug is an anti-parasite drug that is approved for use in human beings and veterinary. They won the Nobel Prize, the people who invented this drug. not harmful at all, no side effects. Obviously, anything has side effects if you completely overdose on something. I discovered this, and then I realized my GP in India, who's one of the top GPs from a famous Parsi doctor family, who looks after the Bollywood stars and the cricketers. I said, Rusum, have you been using Ivamectin? He said, it's been on my protocol since the pandemic started. I said, how many patients have you treated with Ivamectin? He said, 1,500 at least. I said, how many of them have died? He said, one. He was 88 years old and he didn't listen to me. But otherwise, they've all, within days, are positive. And it's been on the protocol, no side effect. This is the dosage 5 times. The moment you test positive or symptoms, you take Ivamectin. Oxford University agreed to start the trials in June. They started the volunteers in January. January, they started recruiting volunteers in June. Why? Why not try it out? What have you got to lose? And I've got trial after trial around the world that shows it works. So I think therapeutics, if you can find things like that are proven to work, along with vaccines, a game changer. Countries on the red list, the travel lists that have devastated. India, fortunately, is no longer on the red list. South Africa has been on the red list since December. Why? Why not be more flexible on that? Labor shortages, huge problem. Now, people blame it on Brexit. There is an element of Brexit to blame for labor shortages, but it's a global phenomenon. We can discuss this more. The furlough scheme's coming to an end now. Will we now have problems because of the furlough scheme coming to an end? Lifelong learning, we think, is very important. I was a member of the Centenary Adult Education Commission. Now, why Centenary? It was set up in 1919 after the First World War to have an adult learning commission. And when we did it 100 years later, this is before the pandemic, so much of what we were talking about was exactly the same challenges as 100 years ago. The government has listened to that and they're acting on that. Now, the problem with labor shortages is an economy needs access to labor. And we've got a points-based system that we've taken from Australia, which we've always respected as a great points-based system, but it needs flexibility. And at the moment, we've got drivers. Everyone's heard of driver shortages, but it's not just drivers. It's lots of different occupations at the moment, and business is suffering. Now, the government says you do the training up domestically. Now, how long does it take to train up people? It takes time. So can we not have a more flexible system where there's meant to be a shortage occupation list that we can use? The job retention scheme, I've spoken about social care. Now, talking about what you just mentioned, Alexander. I am a firm believer that the way out of this is not raising taxes. I remember being on Question Time last year in April, and it was the day that I went on Question Time that it came to light that people were being sent into care homes from hospital without being tested. And it came to light, and I did a lot of research on it, that the care home sector basically has been neglected, and social care has been neglected. The next day, by the way, Matt Hancock started wearing not just the NHS badge, but he wore the care badge. But neglected by all governments over the years. It's NHS, rightly so, but the care sector. And if I could give you statistic after statistic, show you how badly underfunded it's been, and how badly people get paid in this sector as well. A lot of it is private and public. That's the other aspect of it. Millions of people working in it, millions of people being taken care of at home and in care homes and in nursing homes. So now we've got this funding of social care, but the wrong way to do it is putting up taxes, and in particular national insurance, to do that. And then on top of that, there was a surprise that I had no idea about. I don't know how many of you had any idea about this, but this tax on share dividends. I mean, where did that come from? You've got investments that play such a critical role, and we've got a tax that is supposedly being added to dividends. So in February last year, 1 month before our budget, India had its budget. And I remember speaking in a conference with the civil servant, guys who probably knows him by name, in charge of the budget in India. And he made a very important point, and the Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industry, the counterpart of the CBI, and they said, we deliberately did not increase any taxes in our budget because of 2 reasons. 1, businesses have suffered so much in this pandemic. 2, we don't want to stifle the recovery. So before our budget in March last year, I said, I hope our Indian origin chancellor has been listening to the Indians. Do not increase taxes We need to make sure we encourage the growth, encourage investment. What did he do? He didn't increase taxes, but he announced a corporation tax increase from 19% to 25%, but in 2 years' time in 2023. So I thought, great. And now we've got these tax increases coming. So I'm happy to discuss this with all of you. I believe the solution is not austerity. I believe the solution is not tax rises, but is encouraging investment and encouraging growth. Northern Ireland, this is a serious issue. This is a Brexit issue that we can talk about, the Northern Ireland Protocol. Right throughout the Brexit argument, I'm a great Eurosceptic, by the way. I don't like a lot of things about Europe, but on balance, business wanted to remain. One of the things that I thought was completely going to be a problem, the Achilles heel of Brexit, was Northern Ireland. And I just could not see that circle being squared. And the circle has not been squared. The protocol is a serious issue. I was sitting next to one of my senior Northern Ireland peers, a real expert, a real authority in the area. And he was literally in between debates today, and he was crying. So it is a serious problem that we need to resolve. I'm happy to hear that today we got the good news that the flexibility is going to carry on for a longer period. Again, I'd be happy to discuss this. And so before I conclude, Global Britain is something I passionately believe in. If I want to blow my own trumpet, I've been using that term well before the Prime Minister. And I had the privilege of chairing the B7 before the G7. And that was a fantastic meeting. We, of course, had the Prime Minister, but we also had some international visitors. And the two most impressive were Dr. Ngozi, who was the head of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and is now the new head of the World Trade Organization. And she was open. She said, I've taken over this job, and this is a hugely talented individual. She was the World Bank for 25 years, she was finance minister, she was foreign minister of Nigeria, highly, highly talented. And she said, and someone said that the World Trade Organization is in its last chance saloon, and we've got to sort it out. And the other very impressive speaker was Dr. Geeta Gopinath, the chief economist of the IMF, another very impressive individual. And she made a very important point, and they've written an excellent report. If you haven't seen it, read the IMF report on vaccinations. She said, well, three things. One, the recovery from the pandemic globally will be two-track. There will be the countries like the United Kingdom that have spent huge amounts of money supporting their economy. In our case, 400 billion pounds, and that's huge per capita or absolute terms. And countries that have fantastic vaccination programs like the United Kingdom. You will recover quickly. Other countries at the other extreme won't. And Dr. Ngozi made the point about Africa. With Africa, population of India, so 1.4 billion people, 17% of the world's population, 0.25% of the world's vaccine manufacturing capability. And if I give you the statistics of who's been vaccinated, who's not around the world, it's shocking. So that's one point. She said there's two-track recovery. And the other, she said, if you really want to protect the world, everyone's got to be vaccinated. And we talk about we're going to give 400 million vaccines or 1 billion vaccines along with America. We need 11 billion vaccines around the world. That would cost $50 billion. If only the world could get together, get that, and do a licensing agreement. Now, the licensing agreement, I've seen it firsthand. I come from one of the smallest communities in the world, the Zoroastrian Parsis. And I'm very, again, I won't boasting, but per capita of achievement, we're the most successful community in the world. There are only 100,000 of us. And in India, there's 60,000 out of 1.4 billion. And if you go anywhere in India and you say a Parsi, everyone knows a Parsi. One of the most successful Parsis in the world now is the Poonawallas, the owners of the Serum Institute of India. And I spent a whole day there. And I've seen lots of factories, and I can assure you, it's the most impressive I've seen in my life. Out of the 1 billion AstraZeneca Oxford vaccines that have been produced in the world in less than a year, they have produced 600 million of them. So if you have licensing agreements like that around the world, that's how we can address the vaccine situation. And by the way, we still have not approved the Indian Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines for Indians vaccinated in India coming over here. I mean, that's nonsense. This is where I think our government just doesn't get it sometimes. We imported 5 million doses earlier this year, which I helped to bring over. That was fine. From what I've heard, some senior figures in our government have been inoculated with those vaccines. The MHR have approved it, but they have not approved the vaccines for Indians traveling over, including 50,000 Indian students who are starting their academic year right now. So that needs to be done. And finally, climate change, which I'd like to talk about in detail, including Professor Das Gupta of Cambridge University, who produced that fantastic report on the economics of biodiversity. And if I quote him, he said, "Nature is our most precious asset," and David Attenborough spoke about it as well. So to summarize, we at the CBI are pretty confident. We think the next decade there's £700 billion worth of opportunity in the economy. We put it into 6 pillars: a decarbonized economy, an innovation economy, globalized economy, a regionally thriving economy, an inclusive economy. By the way, I'm the first president of the CBI from an ethnic minority background ever, and I've launched an initiative called Change the Race Ratio to promote ethnic minority participation in business. We can talk about that. And a healthier nation. So there we are. Started for 10.
You've raised just about every issue under the sun there. So let's narrow them down. Why don't we start off with global Britain and talking a little bit, since you have Indian heritage and you've talked a bit about India. And by the way, I've checked, and I've had the AstraZeneca vaccination, and one of the 2 vaccinations I had, the vaccine came from India. You can look up the code and
That's right.
You can work it out. So so far so good. So far so good. The Indian foreign minister yesterday said that India was fast-tracking negotiations with Australia to try to achieve a free trade agreement, and that the Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister, and others in the government are really enthusiastic about this. And I used to be the Australian Foreign Minister, which had always had a great love of India, and always thought there was more. They're good at cricket, by the way, aren't they? Wasn't that an amazing win yesterday? We lived through that during the Australian summer when we thought we had them, and they always won in the end. But India, in business terms, is quite difficult to deal with, and of course it's a federation, so there are the states. And to what extent is the CBI and the UK generally, as part of global Britain, optimistic that it can negotiate some really meaningful trade liberalisation agreement with India, and what work has been done to achieve that?
Yes, and firstly, addressing the more important issue of cricket. I went to this event last week to celebrate the 50th anniversary of India winning its first test series in the UK, in England. And Farooq Engineer, another Zoroastrian Parsi, was there.
Him, yeah.
And Farooq was, they told the stories, and he brought the moth-eaten cap that he wore 50 years ago and auctioned it off. And he was one of the last 2 batsmen.
But he's still alive.
He's still alive. He's over 80. One of the last 2 batsmen when they hit the winning run, and about the crowd storming, and and Abid Ali trying to get a stump as a souvenir. Forget it. He was carried away. So it was a great story. And I think winning, and that was the Oval. And yesterday's result was a surprise to many. England was expecting to win, but anyway, I enjoyed the cricket. May the best team win. And with the trade deal, talking to your successor, to George Brandis, he told us about the Australian deal with the UK. And the CBI played a role in that, in helping to get that over the line, including a meeting with Minister Tihan, the Trade Minister, before he went for his final negotiation with Liz Truss. By the way, hats off to Liz Truss. People said we'd never be able to roll over the agreements that the EU had, over 60 bilateral agreements around the world. Oh, where will these countries give a country of 66 million people the same as 500 million people, the biggest trading bloc in the world? You'll never get the same terms. You'll never do it on time. We rolled over all of those, over 66 of them, before December, which was fantastic. Not only we rolled them over, we've signed the new deals that started to happen, and the first one was Australia. And it was done in exactly 365 days. I mean, that's extraordinary. 365 days to negotiate a full, comprehensive, modern trade deal that includes services, that includes financial services, that includes innovation. I mean, it's a phenomenal deal. So it can be done. And our trade with Australia at the moment is about 22 billion pounds. Our trade, the UK and India, is about 24 billion pounds. Now, the trade with India should be much higher. The trade with Australia, already the deal has been very positive. and I think will help a lot. With India, the EU has been trying to do a trade deal for decades, but I think we'll be able to do a deal. And we've announced an enhanced trade partnership with India, which is an ambition to double our trade to £50 billion by 2030. And we've started work on an FTA. And the High Commissioner would like to say more about this. The FTA, the consultation started, we put in our submission from the CBI, and we're saying speed is of the essence. And also, don't wait for the final trade deal. Maybe it won't take 365 days, but have some concessions on the way. So Scotch whisky, the duty is 150%. Don't bring it down to zero, maybe that's dreaming, but bring it down to 50 this year, and maybe 50 next year, and then come down to when you have the FTA. So that we could do staging posts along the way. But there is a will now to make it happen, a genuine will to make it happen. And the British companies in India, by the way, average growth rate 26% a year. Some of them growing at over 100% a year. The Indian companies over here doing phenomenally well. Billions of turnover, employing hundreds of thousands of people. Grant Thornton produced a report both ways now. So it's not just trade in goods, but it's trade in services, but it's also bilateral investment as well. So I don't know if High Commissioner wants to comment on this.
But it's obviously a grand aspiration, and I must say I was very impressed with the speed with which the UK negotiated the free trade agreement with Australia, because that wasn't a rollover agreement. That was because Australia has been trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU for years and years and years. And it took Canada, I think, 7 years to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. So everybody was saying at the time of Brexit, well, it'll take years and years to negotiate these agreements. But we know from experience in Australia it doesn't. It took us 16 months to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, so, and then 12 months with the UK. So these things can be done quite quickly.
And New Zealand is about to happen.
Yes.
Any day now.
It may well do. Though you talk a lot about the British economy and taxes rising, I think I would observe huge increases in government spending, some of them driven by the COVID crisis, and the government just had no choice but to respond to that with the furlough scheme and a whole lot of other subsidy schemes. But we are moving into an era now where the sort of liberal market model, which was forced through in this country by Margaret Thatcher and pretty much embraced by Tony Blair through all of his years in power. So he had those two, I would take a risk and say very substantial prime ministers. I don't think Tony Blair's so popular, but I'm not sure why. I thought he was very impressive as a prime minister myself. Anyway, those two prime ministers really drove that liberal market model. It does look now as though that has become unfashionable here. And what is the business view of that? Do they want governments to get back to that sort of Thatcher-Blair economic model, or are they comfortable with this new sort of a bit more tax, a lot of extra spending, more regulation, a more interventionist model?
If you look back on it, there's no question about it. With Margaret Thatcher, whether I had the privilege of knowing her when I first started in the House of Lords 15 years ago, she would come in once a week, whatever happened, and she would sit on the front bench when they were in opposition and in the Labour years. And I would be speaking and she'd be sitting just there. And I got to know her. And looking back on it, she transformed this country. There's no question about it. She opened up the economy. She championed entrepreneurship. She encouraged business. And the economy boomed. Britain opened up. And it changed the face of this country from being the sick man of Europe in the early 1980s to being a growing economy today. To this day, we're the sixth largest economy in the world with 1% of the world's population. So I think it worked. And Tony Blair carried on with that. Everyone thought a Labour government, oh no, taxes are going to go up. No, in fact, we've had one of the lowest rates of tax under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Looking back on it, wow, I wish we'd have those days again in terms of taxes. And it worked. And by the way, Tony Blair, if it hadn't been for Iraq, I was privileged to know him very well. I've known him very well to this day. He would have been one of the greatest prime ministers in this country. and looking back on what he achieved economically, what he achieved in changing his party and transforming his party from what it was in the 1970s and 80s to what it became. So now, fast forward, I don't think it's fair to say that things have changed interventionist-wise. That's for a reason. The pandemic has brought intervention in, and I don't think the government particularly wants to intervene in that way. Naturally, there'll be less interventionist. In terms of taxes, if you look at the graph, the tax take in this country has never crossed 40%. Never crossed 40%. So you always got a deficit. It's very rare that we balanced our books. And government expenditure we've tried to get it about 40%. So if you're at 37-38% tax income and you've got 40% government expenditure, now government expenditure has shot up, and I've just spoken about the 400 billion. And we've taken on a whole lot of debt. But I don't think that in a time of emergency, this is something to be that scared of. If you look back to the Second World War, and okay, this is not a war, but this is pretty much a global crisis that we've never seen before, debt over here in this country went up to 250%. We only paid that off in 2006. It came down to 100% from 1945 to 1963, from 250% to 100%. We're 100% now. So, and interest rates are very low. At 0.1%, it's the lowest since the Bank of England was founded in 1694. So we've got very low rates of interest. High debt doesn't worry me at this stage. And I think now is the time to give businesses that room and encourage the investment, encourage the growth. The interventionism should be limited as much as it can, and I think the government will do that, but I don't approve of tax rises at this stage.
So the government is financing, other than most recently with the announcement today of the increase in national insurance, and they have announced the increase in company tax, of course, a few months ago. But the government is largely financing the increase in spending through borrowing, but also through the Bank of England's quantitative easing program. So what this is doing, it's easy to borrow the money when the interest rates are almost zero. But all of this extra money going into the economy is creating asset inflation. The share market's very high, property prices are very high, and inflation is creeping up. And conventional economists would tell you that if you pump more money into the economy and you don't increase production by the extent to which you're increasing the money supply, it's going to create inflation. It's common sense, isn't it? That must be the case. And with the American president team announcing increases in expenditure of $6 trillion, British government's done what it's done, EU governments, Australian governments, it's done, they're all doing it, and we all know why. If this triggers inflation, and particularly inflationary expectations, then interest rates will go up. This could be catastrophic for business.
So it is a serious
So
worry.
is this something that you reflect on?
I'm very worried about it. I've been saying this for a long time, that I'm worried about inflation. Because if we can control the inflation, and people worried about inflation after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and inflation has stayed well around the 2% or lower. We haven't had a problem. Japan has debt much higher than we have. Japanese debt at the moment is 170%, 180%, and they've not had inflation either. So I'm not saying we're exactly like Japan as an economy, but I am worried about inflation, because if there is inflation, that will lead to interest rate rises. And at the moment, we're so used to, just look back on it. Before the financial crisis, 5% interest rates was considered a low rate of interest. If interest rates go up from 0.1% to 5% now, it'll be devastation. So we've got to be, I mean, even if it goes up to 1% at the moment, it will hurt a lot. And our government borrowing, a lot of our government borrowing, a high proportion of it is linked to interest rates. A lot of it's long-term, but a lot of it is also very sensitive. So if government borrowing goes up and the interest charge on that goes up, that's a problem as well, let alone for the private sector, let alone for individuals and mortgages and things. So it is a worry, inflation. The economists say at the moment there is no long-term structural worry about inflation, any inflation now. And they're predicting, by the way, inflation is now going to go up to 4.5%. But by the middle of next year, it'll come back down to below 2%, because they don't think it's caused from a structural point of view. So, but it's something personally I'm very worried about.
But it is going up.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure myself. I feel slightly uncomfortable. But so here is the last issue, and then I'm going to throw it open to all of you to ask anything you like, because you're a politician, really. So being a member of the House of Lords and the leader of the country's principal business organisation, I want to ask you about climate change and the extent to which business is focused on this. I mean, there's a certain amount of rhetoric which everyone signs up to. Climate change is a problem, climate emergency, we've got to do more. And the British government has set a target of net zero emissions by 2050. But I mean, I'm just a dairy farmer's son from the Adelaide Hills, so you wouldn't expect much of me. But I don't see how they're going to get there. That's without talking of spending money, without a huge degree of economic disruption, including, by the way, to the motor industry, but with heating systems and so on. I mean, there's going to be a huge transformation if this is ever to be achieved, and presumably Boris Johnson will no longer be the Prime Minister by 2050. So nobody will be held to account for making this commitment.
When he spoke to us at the B7 in May, he typical Boris, he said, the road to net zero is not a zero-sum game. So there's got to be a benefit from doing it. Not just a benefit to the environment, but it's got to be worth doing, ideally more efficient, let alone being more environmentally friendly. And that would be the game changers if we can actually do that. At the moment, I chaired the Heat Commission at the CBI, and the Heat Commission, we came up with 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions are from heat, and half of that is from buildings. And of the 29 million houses in this country, only 1 million of them are up to the standard if we're ever going to reach net zero by 2050. And to revamp those other 28 million houses, if you use heat pumps, well, that's really expensive, and it's not really appropriate.
£10,000.
At least. Then if you use hydrogen, now hydrogen heating is not yet available. Now it could be down the line, using the existing gas pipes, for example. That's got to be developed. So, we've got the solutions of how to get there. We've got community heating, we have an Olympic-style delivery authority that does this around the country. But to your point, executing it is going to be a challenge. And the same goes to electric vehicles, and. And the other thing that Boris Johnson said, again, this is typical Boris, green is good. Yeah, as you say, it's great to say that. How are you actually going to make it happen? Oh. And I think that walking the talk, so a point I made in Parliament today, 1/3 of our largest businesses, with a market cap of £650 billion, have already committed to net zero publicly by 2050. And they're firms like EY, this year, in the middle of a pandemic, at the beginning of this year, said they're going to start going carbon negative from this year. Now, you make a statement like that, you've got to deliver that going carbon negative. Microsoft has done exactly the same.
But EY don't make anything.
No, but as an organization, they can still, every organization can do its bit. And we're trying to get more and more companies to make this commitment and then walk the talk.
Right, well, good luck with that one. John, I saw you put your hand up.
Thank you, and thank you for your thoughts. You didn't mention China. Could you give some thoughts?
I'm so sorry. Could I ask you to use the microphone? Because we're live streaming.
You didn't mention
it's live streamed.
You didn't mention China. Could you give us your thoughts on two issues? One, what limits should there be on Chinese investment in the UK? We've moved beyond the golden era. We have our eyes more widely open. Where should that line be drawn? And secondly, given your role in universities, how dependent should we, British universities, allow them to become upon income from Chinese students and Chinese research?
China, whichever way you look at it, is now a superpower. In absolute terms, it will overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world in the near future. But that's in absolute terms. In per capita terms, it'll be nowhere near. So I think those people who talk about the decline of America and the American empire is over. I think never, in my view, underestimate the strength of the United States of America as a country and all that it has going for it, including its amazing innovative power, its universities, its financial system, its natural resources, its geographical location. It is phenomenally powerful and always will be. Where China's concerned, we know we've got to do business with China with our eyes wide open. Nobody condones what's going on in China, whether it's the Uyghurs. We say when we do business with China, we do not approve of that. What's going on in Hong Kong, we do not approve of that. But it's £100 billion of business for the UK. We want to join the CTPPP now, and thanks to the Australian deal and the New Zealand deal, we will join the CTPPP soon, hopefully. That's £110 billion of 11 countries. So one country, £110 billion, 11 countries. That's how influential and important China is from a business point of view. You can't just suddenly say, I'm not going to do business with China. So we have to do business with China with our eyes wide open. And when it comes to students, they are by far the largest number of students are from China. And India is the second largest. And the Indian figures, by the way, are growing and growing. They're going to grow. One of the reasons why, because I worked very hard to bring in the post-study work visa, the 2-year post-study work visa in 2007-8. And they brought that in. Number of students from countries like India's rocketed. Theresa May took it away in 2012. We've been fighting to get it back. When Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he announced it started again in July. And you see the number, guys who will know the numbers better than I do, but it's over 50,000 Indian students already coming this year, and it'll grow very rapidly. So the Chinese students may be the highest now, but countries like India, the numbers will increase as well. And Chinese research, I know from firsthand how much it goes on at Cambridge, for example. I know there are research students that are co-sponsored by the Chinese government at Cambridge. That's how much they value their students being educated at the top institutions in the world. So it's this balance of dealing with China, but also the reality.
But are you worried about the security issues?
Absolutely.
Chinese investment in critical national
We've got to,
infrastructure?
and you've seen Kwasi Kwarteng is constantly saying, right, no, we've got to look at this one before we allow the investment. And the government has started to do that, and we've got to be very careful.
Okay, yes. We need the microphone because we're live streaming the event. You do that one. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry. In your own business journey, Lord Bilimoria, sort of launching Cobra, what did you find in the business environment that actually helped and conversely hindered launching a new business without having that background in F&B or in any industry for that matter?
I think that this country used to be looked upon as a very bad country to be an entrepreneur. It was a very closed economy. I remember in the early 80s, it was pretty much a closed shop. You hadn't gone to the right school, the right university, a lot of doors were closed. Entrepreneurship was looked down upon, second-hand car salesman, Del Boy. And I think Margaret Thatcher changed all that. I think that she started celebrating entrepreneurship. People like David Young, her business minister, people like Richard Branson were celebrated in her time. And now this country is one of the best countries in the world to set up your business. Increasingly, from the time I set up Cobra Beer to now, it's just got better and better and better for being the best country in the world to set up your business, whether it's access to finance, whether it's the right environment of networks of entrepreneurs, access to Europe at the doorstep of Europe, the global location, the English language, you name it, the legal system we have over here. We've got the best lawyers, the best courts, the fairest trials in the world, everything at our doorstep. And I think it's fabulous. What we're missing, by the way, is we don't have a NASDAQ. And I keep saying this, if we could, Euronext is taking a lot of business from us at the moment. And AIM hasn't quite lived up to what its expectations were. I think we need a NASDAQ alongside the London Stock Exchange. I keep saying it, but no one's listening at the moment. But in spite of that, we're a great country to start a business, and I recommend it wholly.
Yeah. Hard to see from here.
Yeah, it's a bit dark. So I'm curious about academia. You talked about several areas, and I'll touch on academia now because I wanted to ask about China, that was asked. I wanted to ask about business, that was asked. So I'll go about academia. So as an individual doing a PhD myself, and obviously you're in the world of academia as well, I know that one of the criticisms of Brexit initially was that it's going to be difficult for the UK to collaborate with countries. Of course, Europe had a very positive academic relationship there. And I'm curious, what do you think about the future of British research and British science, and who will the UK be able to kind of maybe collaborate with when they're replacing the EU? Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, I just want to emphasize this about China, that we have to continue collaborating in terms of doing business with and universities. So it's not a binary situation. And as I say, we've got to try as best as possible to partner ahead. And I saw that firsthand yesterday. The Judge Business School has set up an executive MBA program with China. And there was somebody from China present at the event I went to yesterday. And I think that's terrific. The more exchange we can have in that sense is very good. When it comes to research and development innovation, you've touched on something that is music to my ears. We've been spending 1.7% of GDP on R&D and innovation in this country. We've got this target to supposedly get to 2.4%. America, Germany spends 2.8%. Israel, they're off the charts, 4%. Now just imagine if we spend 1% more on R&D and innovation, that's another £20 billion a year, let alone the catch-up over the years. And I sat on a task force of universities and business focused on R&D and innovation, and it showed the potential. Now, here's the thing. When you think R&D and innovation, you think universities, but actually it's businesses as well. And you think, oh, the money's coming from government. Yes, it comes from government. Huge chunk of the R&D investment comes from abroad in the UK. So most people don't know this. We're the second largest recipient of inward investment in the world. So we've got to continue to be a magnet for inward investment, including for R&D and innovation. And the potential for universities and business to work together is huge. And with that, the CBI, I told you about our plans about, the government uses the term leveling up. It's a pretty cliched term now. But that leveling up is real in terms of clusters. And we have proven already clusters work in the Silicon Valley cluster or the Boston, MIT, Harvard cluster. But we have our own world-class cluster at Cambridge. And it started off as a tech cluster with spin-outs from the university like Acorn Computers, ARM, these tech companies. Now it's gone further into life sciences. So the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was developed by Oxford University, but AstraZeneca is a British-Swedish company headquartered where? In Cambridge. So that is now spun out into a life sciences cluster. And I think the potential for clusters around the country, including in Edinburgh, in the Northeast, in Manchester, in Bristol, there's an aviation cluster, Birmingham manufacturing cluster. And that is going to power R&D with universities at the heart of these clusters. So I think the potential is huge, and we need to really get behind this. And the government has a big role to play in enabling that and encouraging that.
Well, the government runs the catapult programs, don't they? Jointly, or government doesn't run them, has inspired and financed them, but they're run with industry and universities. They seem to
and
work
they've been
well.
a good start, but I think we've got to go much further.
Yeah. High Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you. Lord Bilimoria, I would like to compliment you on your leadership in the CBI. And my question has to do with both your hats in business and in the House of Lords. And it also addresses a question that Mr. Downer sort of raised. With regard to the inflow of students, tourists, professionals, businessmen from all over the world, which really adds to the energy in all these fields in the UK. It would be important at some point for all of us to agree on what really goes into a vaccine passport, in the sense that, just like you have in the ICAO, telling all the countries what should be in a passport so that it's acceptable by all the, acceptable to all the border police or, those who see who's coming in. So this would be useful so that countries can very easily accept based on an acceptable number of things that must be on a vaccine passport. So that's something on which I think governments need to work together. And you, as one who's solidly supported the strengthening of relations between India and UK, I think in the policy making, I think it would be a great help, not only with India, but I think with the rest of the world as well. So just this is my suggestion that we must have vaccine passports worked on as soon as possible.
Thank you, Excellency. If I may, I will take this opportunity to say what an outstanding High Commissioner you've been, and a great friend between the two countries in the time that you've been here, in the most challenging of times. And I've seen firsthand during the sad crisis that happened in India in April and May with the wave that hit India, the work that you personally did with your team was outstanding. It was a privilege to do our best to help you with that as well. On this topic, and I alluded earlier, and I spoke about how we need recognition. So I've been in touch with the vaccine minister here, who I think Nadeem Zaw is doing a fantastic job. There's now a global initiative where we're trying to get a mutual recognition of vaccine passports. So you don't have the situation where you've been vaccinated by this particular Indian vaccine under a certain brand, but the one in India is not recognized. I mean, it's just completely illogical. So we've got to have consistency. And by the way, I saw an operation in India. I went back to India after it came off the red list, thankfully. And when you're traveling between certain states in India, they want to see your double vaccination status. And it's very efficient, very quick, it works very easily. So I'm all for that. I'm trying my best to make this happen. Just while it reminded me of something I did not mention, and we have not mentioned so far, is Afghanistan. So I don't know how much longer we have, but is there time to talk about Afghanistan?
Afghanistan, well, very quickly.
Okay. Well, we had the emergency.
See, I'm being told to wind it up.
So
but I don't think we should let Afghanistan just hang out there. You go for it.
So we had the emergency recall on the 18th of August. And by the way, people don't realize, Parliament's been recalled very, very rarely. The last time was in 2013 for Syria, when we decided not to intervene at that time. And then this time on Afghanistan. And one of the points that I made, and maybe one other peer made it, was nobody mentioned India. And when India and Afghanistan is concerned, India is one of the biggest trading partners of Afghanistan. Secondly, India has invested hugely in infrastructure. Billions of dollars worth of roads, of serious infrastructure that's been carried out in Afghanistan. And the point that I made about Afghanistan was that Tom Tugendhat made it brilliantly in his speech in the Commons, was we were there for 20 years. It took 10 years. The actual operation was an instant success in getting rid of Al-Qaeda. You could speak on much more authoritatively than I can, but in broad brush terms, and the initial objective was immediate. Took 10 more years to get Osama bin Laden. So you could then say the objective was finally achieved. But then by then, all the advancement in Afghanistan was taking place. So you fast forward another 10 years, 20 years later, women, school children up to over 30%. Universities, over 100,000 women at universities. 20% of the workforce, women. And huge advances that have taken place. And it had come down to 20,000 troops from 39 countries. Of course, America was the highest of them all, keeping this with the conflict having stopped in 2014. So why did we have to cut and run when all these advances were taking place? And the analogy I made was in Germany, 75 years later, the Americans have 40,000 troops as we speak in Germany, double the number of 39 countries in Afghanistan. In Japan, we've got people since over 75 years. In South Korea, for decades. It's a long game. And if you're making advance, if you're making a difference, I don't think we should have cut and run. And it's destabilized things in a big way for the whole world, and it was completely avoidable.
And not good for India. Not good for India, I would have. Okay, very quickly.
We have one question at the back as well, Alexandra. If you...
I can just do one. I think we've...
Okay, just coming.
Just thinking of your family history and your own of the course of your own life, could you say a few words on your view of the peculiarity of the British-Indian relations? I observe both in Britain and in India a great affection, mutual affection, despite all the prejudices and resentments. And I'm thinking of a more spiritual and psychological level of it, and whether this could determine that possible integration between Britain and India following Brexit, which, and again, I'm thinking not only of economy, but culturally, in terms of education, and so on and so on.
Thank you. I mean, this is a topic we could speak for hours about, but in a nutshell, we have. I always say it. When I was founding chair of the UK India Business Council, I would say that the UK has a special relationship with two countries, two large countries, America and India. And the Indian relationship goes back 400 years. And of course, there's all that history, but it's still a very close, special relationship. And the way you see it is quite stark. I remember once we went on a delegation with Tony Blair to India. It was a large business delegation. And we took over a British Airways jumbo jet, and we called it Blair Force One. And we went first to China, and we were in Beijing, and they rolled out the red carpet. It was a very, very constructive time in China, went off very well. A lot of it was through interpreters. When we then went from Beijing to Delhi, and you could see the business delegation when we were in India, it's the same wavelength. They just can communicate. It's all very familiar. It's a very close relationship. It's a very deep relationship. It should never be taken for granted. You can't buy it. You can't switch something like that on. And so solid, given all the challenges over the centuries, it's still a special relationship. And one of the strongest elements of it, the 1.5 million people of Indian origin like me who live here. And that is the living bridge between our countries. And I'm so proud to say, I'm sorry if I'm boasting, but my 1.5 million people here are now doing really, really well. We're at the top of this country, whether it's the Chancellor, whether it's the Home Secretary, whether it's Alok Sharma, just at the cabinet table, whether it's some of the largest business in this country, whether it's, you name it. We've got Indians reaching the very top. And the Indian diaspora of 30 million people, Indians are very proud of and see them as a living bridge. So in my case, I'm proud to be a Zoroastrian Parsi. I'm proud to be a nation of Britain. I'm very proud to be British. And I'm very proud to be Indian. And that will never change. So thank you for that question.
That's a very good note to end on, and a very happy note to end on. I, as an Australian, do note the not only the fact that there are people of Indian heritage who hold very senior positions in this country, but the most popular politician at the moment in this country, well, he was until today, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So you do get the feeling that in this country, buried away there somewhere, is great affection for India. I mean, you do get that in my own country too. It's a pity their cricket team is so good, though, isn't it? Anyway, I was supporting India against England. But in cricket, for some reason or other, I always hope England lose, I'm sorry to tell you. Although in other sports, not necessarily. All right, well, thank you very much indeed for a wonderful performance and for being so informative, so interesting. Such a great life story, but also you bring so much experience and so much wisdom to debates that are very lively in this country today, and it's been very good of you not only to come along tonight and spend time with us at ROSL, and I know you've been here on many occasions before, but to provide some Cobra beer as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.